This is a conversation with Michael Levin. He is a developmental and synthetic biologist and a distinguished professor at Tufts University. In this conversation, we discuss the intersection between computation and biology, how he fell in love with both. We talk about bioelectricity and how it explains why we get cancer and why robots don't get cancer. We also talk about high order goal propagation in organisms, regenerative biology, Xenobots, the philosophical implications of regeneration, and we also talk about the human mind. And now, to continue this introduction, here's a special guest appearance by Himanshu Kohli and Suraj Hegde.
ಇದು ನೋ ಟೈಮ್ यूट्यूबಲ್ಲಿ लाईक कॉमेंट सबस्क्राईब माडी
आणि ॲपल म्युझिकवर 5 स्टार द्यायचं आणि रील्सवर बघायचं, फॉलो करायचं, लाईक करायचं, काहीही करू, पण आपल्या भावाला सपोर्ट करायचं. पेटीएमवर पैसे द्यायचे, रील्सवर पैसे द्यायचे, कारण काय आपला भाऊ खूप गरीब आहे.
ಸ್ಪಾಟಿಫೈ ಪಾಡ್ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಇದೆ ಕೇಳಿ, ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಾಗ್ರಾಮ್ ಫಾಲೋ ಮಾಡಿ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
Takeout?
When you were growing up, two aspects of your childhood had a big influence on you. One, your father worked for DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and on many days he took you to the office and you got the opportunity of just fiddling around with all these computers that they were throwing around. And that sparked a love for computers and coding in your life. The second aspect that had an influence on you was this neighbor that used to collect insects, and that rekindled your love for biology, so much so that when you enrolled in college, even though you enrolled for a bachelor's in computer science, you ended up graduating with a dual bachelor's in computer science and biology. Let's start here. Why do you think you gravitated towards these two very separate fields, computer science and biology? When you look back now in hindsight, what was it about these fields that attracted you so strongly at such a young age?
Yeah, actually, it started even before that because when my dad worked for digital, I was about 10 at that point, and by then we had already moved to the United States. But well before that, so some years before that, my dad was an engineer. We lived in the Soviet Union. He was an engineer, and I had asthma, and we didn't have any medications for it. And so one of the things he would do to during my asthma attacks to kind of to reduce the stress and take the attention off of it was to take the back off of the TV set. So we had this giant TV set with this tiny little screen, and it had these vacuum tubes and all this stuff inside. And he would take the back off, and we would sit there and just look at it. And from as early as I can remember, this was this made an incredible impact on me because it was very obvious that somebody knew how to put all those pieces together to make it do the things that it did. And so this idea, and I said, so who did this? How do people know how to do this? And he said, well, they're called engineers, and and you can learn to do it, right? Anybody can learn to do it, and there's a science of it. And I said, well, that's the thing for me is to figure out, because it just seemed like whoever knew how to do that really was sort of had the world in the palm of their hands, right? And that's where actually I also had a friend who was very into bugs and insects and things like this, and we would look at the behavior of these different things, and he would say, look, here's an egg, and this thing's going to turn into a caterpillar, and that thing's going to have a set of behaviors, and then that's going to turn into a butterfly later on, and we'll do something else. Those things. And also I had a friend who was my age, and she had leukemia, and she died when I was probably about 7, and that also was part of that whole triangle, because I spent a lot of time thinking about, what actually happened to her? Like, where is she now? And how did she come to be? And how did I come to be? And where were we before we were born, if anywhere? And how do we, how does the caterpillar body put itself together? How does our mind put itself together? Where do these things come from? Where do they go? So these issues were with me at a very young age. And then by the time I was 10 or 11, my dad got a job at DEC, and he would bring home these computers, and that was kind of the obvious natural extension of it, because there you have the electrical engineering, the technology, but they also seem to be doing things like following an algorithm, calculating things, right? The simple logic, and so where does that come from? How did you get from physics to logic, right? So those are the things.
Even though you had these two distinct passions, was it immediately obvious to you that there is a connecting link between computation and biology, or that happened much later?
No, it was always there. It always seemed to me that the question of, people talk about like I was always interested in intelligence and artificial intelligence in particular, because of course, if you want to think that you know what something is, you should be able to make one, right? That's how you know whether you know what it is. And it always seemed amazing to me that right here in biology, right here in front of us, we have that process of going the full journey from physics and chemistry. So you have this little egg, this little blob of chemicals, and right there in front of your eyes, it becomes a creature with memories, goals, preferences, right? Or it doesn't, and so those two things seemed completely connected. The origin of the mind and the origin of the body always seemed like the same, kind of the same problem to me.
Merging biology and computation was quite a radical idea back in the 90s. In fact, you were pleasantly surprised when your mentor, Susan Ernst, agreed to your idea of applying computational perspectives in biology, even though most of the professors didn't feel that way. A professor famously berated you in front of the class, saying that you were wasting everyone else's time. And we've come a long way since that day, but I want to see if the lines are starting to blur even more. Now the lines between computation and not just biology, maybe even physics, have started to blur. Case in point being the most recent Nobel Prize in physics. Where do we go next? Do you feel that computational biology is always going to be a separate field as compared to traditional biology or physics? Or as we move forward, this intersection is going to become greater and greater, so much so that computational biology will just become biology, that it's nothing but a way of upgrading the tools we are using. And if we actually have to make progress in physics or biology, we just have to merge with computational biology.
Yeah, overall, I don't think that different fields really exist. I think they are ways that we try to simplify the business of doing science and doing discovery and doing education. So it's helpful for organizational purposes to have departments and journals and conferences that try to carve some sort of area. But I really think, like back in the day before science really got going, when we had natural philosophy, right? So there were people who they didn't see a difference. The great scholars of the past did not see a difference between all these different fields, because many of these things are connected. And so, in some cases, it's helpful to try and make specific distinctions. And in other cases, those distinctions and these barriers between fields are limiting, and they're keeping you from important discoveries. And so I think hopefully in the future, what we will recognize is that none of these things that we study are our formal models. So people argue, are living things computers? Are they Turing machines and all that? And nothing is a Turing machine. We have formal models of computation that we can try to apply to, let's say, life or not life, and see how well those models help us interact with these things. But let's not pretend that that's what these things actually are in some deep, unique, objective sense. And so as we apply different perspectives, there will be, and there already are, people applying tools from cognitive science and behavior science to molecular events inside of cells. We do this in our lab, other people do too. And so they use a cognitive lens. Other people might use a cybernetic lens, and other people will use perspectives from physics and things like that. But all of these are just a bag of tools that we can bring to understand complex problems. And I don't think the complex problems don't obey the neat lines that we try to draw.
This reminds me, a lot of musicians say something similar about musical genres, where they say that these categories actually don't exist for musicians. This is just for marketing purposes, organizational purposes, but there are actually no genres in music. Okay, a lot of questions about your work. You already alluded to this interest you had early in your life about how do we go from, let's say, an egg to an entire human being, or how does the mind develop? So let's start diving straight into it. I want to start with the potentially silly question, but I hope that will set the foundation. It'll put us on the same page, and then we can move on to the follow-up questions. Let's start with bioelectricity. Let's quickly define it. What is bioelectricity?
Bioelectricity refers to the ability of cells and other biological components to communicate in electrical networks. So they exploit the physics of electric processes in the world to do several things: to process information, and to, more importantly, to serve as a kind of cognitive glue, to bind parts together into a larger whole. Just like the reason that you and I are more than just a pile of our neurons, right? We have hopes and dreams and memories and preferences that our individual neurons don't have. And what underlies all of that is the electrical network that enables the collective to process information that no individual part can process. And so that evolution loves that sort of scheme. These bioelectric networks are an extremely convenient and ancient way to do that, to assemble large scale beings out of small parts. And that's why bioelectricity is important.
What are these electrical networks in the cells made of?
Well, individual cells have little tiny proteins on their surfaces which can open and close. And they open and close to let in charges, so things like potassium and chloride and sodium and things like that. And when these charges go in and out and they become unbalanced, there ends up being a voltage gradient, like a little battery, a difference across the membrane. And that voltage difference can be felt by neighboring cells, and it can also cause those little the connections between cells, but also the little ion channels. It can cause them to open or close. So now you see this positive feedback loop, which can be quite complex, because every time the voltage changes, the ion channels and the electrical synapses between cells can open and close, and that will in turn change the voltage, which will in turn change the connectivity. And so now you have this remarkable thing where the topology of the information flow through the network is guided by the content of that, by the electrical properties of that network. That's basically a transistor, right? A transistor is a voltage-gated current conductance. And we know that with transistors, you can build logic gates, and then you can build all of computation. So this is what cells have. They have the ability to it's really a magical thing where the content of the thoughts of the system manipulate the system itself. It's that mind-body. You end up with this mind-body interface. How can information have a physical effect in the world? This is it right here. You're seeing it as soon as you've made cells connected by, for example, voltage-gated ion channels. You now see that the information patterns that they process now affect the system, the structure of the system, and the way that it will process information in the future. So that means learning, that means decision making, potentially, that means all the cognitive steps, maybe.
I definitely agree with you. It does seem magical. You gave a talk in 2020 called "Why Don't Robots Get Cancer?" So given this definition of bioelectric signaling, bioelectricity, why don't robots get cancer, and why do we get cancer?
Right. The better question is not why do we get cancer. The question, I think the real question is, why isn't it all cancer all the time? In other words, why is there anything other than cancer? So if you think about what's happening here, during embryonic development, you start off as a single cell, which then divides. You have a bunch of cells. When we look at an embryo and we say, look, there's one embryo, what are we counting when we say there's one embryo? What is there one of? There's hundreds of thousands or millions of cells. What's there one of? Well, what there's one of is a commitment and alignment of all the cells within anatomical space. All of the cells are in agreement that they are all going to make the same journey in that space of anatomical possibilities. And so they build a human or a giraffe or a tree or whatever they're going to make. So what you're counting on, when you say there's one embryo, is a kind of coherence where they all share the same model of what they're building. They all share the same set point for the anatomical homeostasis. Any kind of homeostatic process, like in your thermostat, that's going to autonomously try to reach a particular outcome, it has to store a set point. It has to store some kind of representation of what it is that it's working to make, and then that way, if things get deviated, which embryos are very good at, if you deviate them from that path, they will do a lot of hard work to get back there, right? So that set point is the thing they're working towards. Well, the process that allows individual cells to cooperate together to share that same worldview of what it is that we're building, that story that binds them all together, is a set of communications, which are electrical, but also chemical, also biomechanical, and so on. And that process, that amazing cognitive glue that allows individual cells, because remember, individual cells they have competencies on their own. They have their own little goals. They used to be independent organisms back in evolution. They navigated the world by themselves. So keeping them together, this cognitive glue, is really important. And what's happening in our bodies is that these mechanisms are keeping all the cells working towards these high level goals, but that process can break down. And when that process occasionally breaks down, the individual cells disconnect from the electrical network of the body. And when they disconnect, their ability to store a large goal state shrinks down. So they can no longer remember that they were part of a mind meld that was working on making a heart or upkeeping a liver or something like that. They basically shrink back to the tiny little goals of unicellular organisms. So proliferate as much as you can, and eat as much as you can, and go wherever life is good. And that's metastasis. And so robots don't have this because, at least for now, and it doesn't have to be this way, but at least for now in our technology currently, most robotics, not all, but most robotics is made at a single level where the parts are passive. They're not competent. They don't have agendas. They don't do anything. But hopefully the collective is intelligent. And so there really isn't any danger of the individual parts disconnecting and going off on their own, which is cancer. And so robots, for now anyway, although of course this is changing with the swarm robotics and things like that, multi-scale robotics. But standard robot architectures, there's no danger that the various parts are going to defect and start to pursue their own goals because they're made of parts that don't have that capacity. But life isn't like that. Life has this multi-scale competency architecture that has goal directedness learning and decision making all the way across the scales. And so we are always susceptible to some of our parts going off on their own. That's the risk we pay for being a multi-scale cognitive architecture.
So I'm not made of billions of dumb zombies, which was at times, I guess, the image that was painted. The cells are these senseless entities that are just doing as they're told, not made up of these Lego blocks, but instead are made up of some form of these intelligent entities that have some form of agency. So each cell has I guess you could allocate some form of, well, definitely agency and maybe some intelligence to it, even if this intelligence doesn't reflect on the level of an organism for me in particular. And that ultimately makes the human body resilient, but also is the downfall because that could result in something like cancer.
Yeah. Yes. Your cells, your subcellular molecular networks, meaning even the collections of molecular pathways inside your cells have several different kinds of learning that they can do. And the decision-making, problem-solving, learning, goal-directedness is at every level. So molecular components, cells, tissues, organs, many other kinds of things in your body that are sort of harder to explain, all have this kind of different levels of autonomy and different levels of problem solving. Now, when you say that you don't notice it, there are two things to keep in mind. First of all, we as humans are, because of our evolutionary history, are obsessed with vision in the three-dimensional world. If we had the ability to feel, instead of seeing all of this, or in addition to seeing all of this stuff, if we had the ability to feel directly our internal body chemistry, okay, let's say our blood, let's say you had 10 more sensors for your blood chemistry, the way we have with taste and things like that. I think we would have no trouble realizing that we have a symbiont, or several symbionts. Our liver, our kidneys, and so on are intelligent beings that navigate these additional dimensions, these 10 physiological dimensions, and they navigate that space to keep us alive every day. It's very hard for us to imagine that because we don't have any conscious access to it. And the other thing that I'll point out is that when you say you are not aware of it, well, right now, our left hemispheres are having this delightful conversation because they're good at speaking up for themselves. But that's not really evident. That's not sufficient to clue us into everything that's going on. And you are not conscious of your various substructures going about their day and having wins and losses and things like that any more than you're aware of my consciousness in my body, right? It's the same thing. Our left hemispheres have access to certain things, and we're good at talking about them and making claims about, well, I'm the owner here, I'm the agent. But there are many others in your body that simply don't have speech, and they don't have the ability to make themselves known in that way. But that's the science of diverse intelligence, is to detect them and be able to communicate with them.
When I say I'm not aware of it, I must specify, I only mean, even it's a shame that I'm made up of billions of intelligent agents, but I have never displayed intelligence as a collective human being. But this does raise an interesting follow-up question, which is, when we think about the mind, the perception is always to assume the mind just resides in the brain. But if you're made up of these billions of cells that all have some form of agency and intelligence, then is it the right approach is to actually think of the mind being a composite of all the cells in the body coming together, and that makes up the being?
Yes, but it's much more than that, because the mind is not the physical stuff. So the cells in your body and the cells in your brain, and there are many other, we could talk about all kinds of unconventional biology about information that resides in the body and gets imprinted onto the brain, and various profound mismatches between the size of the brain and cognitive performance as seen in rare human patients. We can talk about all of that, but the bigger point is that the mind is not the physical stuff, and it's a for lack of a better word, it's a pattern. And there are many patterns in our bodies that represent things we would call much smaller kinds of minds. But there's a very sort of large, significant one that tends to orchestrate the kinds of things that we generally associate with being a functional human. But there are many of these patterns, and yes, they're not just in your brain and in your body, but and of course even beyond, right? So Andy Clark's extended mind thesis, this idea that to the extent that you become in tight functional connection with tools that you have, things like your iPhone and the books that you read and everything else, it becomes very difficult to draw a border around a human mind that is just around that body anyway. Because I mean, let's just think about what's the use of all these what's the use of the terminology, right? When you say my mind is this or that, what you're really saying is functionally, what is the collection of stuff I need to keep track of to understand what this being is capable of? And for sure, it's not just the brain. It is your brain. It is your body. It is all kinds of patterns that exist in both. And it is potentially social structures, technology, and various other things without which, if you don't consider those, you will have a very incorrect and limited view of what that individual is capable of.
I'm itching to take a philosophical digression. In fact, I started this, so I guess I'm responsible. We'll do it. But in fact, before we do that, before we take the philosophical digression, I think it would be helpful to get another quick definition out of the way. What is the cognitive light cone?
The cognitive light cone I define as the size, both in space and time, but also in other kinds of spaces that are not three-dimensional space. But yeah, I'll just give you an example that's easier to understand in 3D space. It's the size of the biggest goals that you can actively pursue. It's not the size of things you are sensitive to. So, for example, the James Webb Telescope has an enormous sensing range. That's not the cognitive light cone. It's not the size of things you can reach out and touch and affect. It's not the causal border of your world. It's not that. The cognitive light cone is the size of the biggest goal that you can pursue. So, for example, if you tell me that all your effort is occupied with managing a tiny little area of 20 microns, and you have 20 minutes memory going backwards and 10 minutes anticipatory potential going forward, I'm going to say you're probably a bacterium. If all you care about is that tiny little region of space-time and everything you do is to manage the conditions within that region of space-time, you're probably a bacterium. And if you tell me that you have more memory going back and you have a little more predictive power going forward, you care about things that happen in an area of hundreds of yards, but there's no way you're ever going to care about what happens in the next town 3 weeks from now, you might be a dog, right? That's your cognitive light cone. There's just nothing that your cognitive system can do to care about things that are further away, but you're pretty good at managing things over a certain radius. If you tell me that you are working really hard to establish a particular social structure, justice, world peace, whatever, for over the whole planet for the next 100 years, long after you're dead, I'm going to say you're probably a human. Okay, that indicates to me that you're a human. And if you tell me that you can care for, with compassion in the linear range, for every being on the planet, let's say, right, you are able to exert active compassion towards an enormous number of beings, that is a claim that you are more than a current standard human. You're some sort of advanced bodhisattva or something. But so all of these things, right? The question of what are you capable of caring about? And when I say care, I don't just mean theoretically things that are interesting to you. I mean practical goals that you can conceive of and work towards. So the size of your goals, and closely tied to that, the things that stress you out, right? So what are you stressed by? If you're stressed by the world financial markets, you're probably a human. If you're stressed by the local sugar concentration, you could be a bacterium. So the question, right, what are you stressed by as a result of being far away from your goals defines the scope of your cognitive being. So that's why I called it the cognitive light cone.
What is your cognitive reach? What is the largest goal that you can achieve? Okay, let's take the philosophical digression. In the book Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle had said that every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. For a long time, biology had this aversion to the teleos or a purpose. It had some form of a teleophobia, but your work has shown that there is a higher order goal that propagates down. And you've called this anatomical homeostasis, right? At least at the cellular level, to be able to self-organize, maintain, and repair structures. And you just mentioned the extended mind thesis as well. Is it possible to actually take this theory even further and beyond one single human being? If the cell is a smaller unit that can self-organize, it has some form of agency, is it also possible to consider human beings as smaller units with agency of some bigger goal that goes beyond the organism? And of course, we organize as communities, as countries, as companies, and often we impart a collective consciousness to, let's say, a country that could have a different goal that propagates down to us as humans, that could be very distinct as well. Do you think this is, and maybe this is getting too philosophical, but do you think this is the first step towards extracting an even bigger teleos, an even bigger purpose, maybe a universal teleos? Is it possible that by continuing this line of work, we ultimately find the light cone of the universe?
Yeah, well, this is an extremely ancient idea. It is present in many very old traditions, and of course, many scientists and philosophers have played with this idea as well. The only things I can say are that it's certainly possible. We have to think that it's possible. I had our graphic artist draw a cartoon for me for these kinds of things where there are two neurons in a brain and they're arguing, and the first neuron is kind of a reductionist materialist, and he says to the other one, he says, "Look, the universe is a cold mechanical place. It doesn't care about us. There's no mind out there. There's just physics and chemistry." And the other neuron is a little bit of a mystic, and he says, "Well, I can't prove it, but I have this feeling that the things that happen to us, these waves that sweep over us, and the pain that we feel when we depolarize, and all this, I can't help but feeling there's a larger thing going on here. Maybe our universe can have thoughts and purpose." And he said, the first one said, "That's crazy." And so, okay, we have to be open to the idea that we are part of a bigger system, because it is probably impossible for us to know it for sure. I can't prove it, but I suspect there's some sort of Gödel thing about not being able to prove that you're part of a bigger system. But I think we could gain evidence of it. And I think we have to be open to the idea that that's true, that the large patterns we see in our lives and in our universe are not random, and also not just not random, but also not just guided by bottom up things like laws of physics. There might be larger scale patterns that are at play, but I want to be very clear here. My framework insists that these questions are empirical questions. In other words, you can't just do the thing that many people do, which is assume that it's true. So lots of people say, well, the universe and the solar system and the planet are bigger than us, and therefore they are larger minds, and we are like neurons in this larger mind. That's a hypothesis. You can't just assume it's true. You can't assume it any more than you can assume the opposite, which is what many people assume, many scientists assume, which is that we are a privileged, unique locus of mind. Everything below is mindless. Everything above is mindless. It's just us. You can't assume that either. None of these things can you derive from an armchair just sitting there philosophically pondering it. You have to do experiments. And doing experiments with larger systems is incredibly hard. Okay, just on a practical level, it's very hard to do those kinds of experiments. But I think we can gather at least evidence for it, and I think we are starting to put together a science of how do you discover these things in very unfamiliar substrates. And the way that we discover mind in cells and molecular networks and tissues and whatever is to make hypotheses about what problem space they're operating in. So it's not this three-dimensional space. It's not linguistic space like we do. It might be the space of metabolic states, or the space of physiological states, or the space of gene expression, or anatomical morphospace. So you make a hypothesis about the space, you make a hypothesis about the goal, and then you put a barrier between them and their goal. And you see how clever are they at getting around. This is William James's definition of intelligence. Same ends by different means. How good are they at getting their goals met despite the things that you're trying to do them? So you're doing these perturbative experiments. So of course, with higher order systems, you can do other things. You can try communicating with them. You can try training them. You can try all these things. You can try learning from them and so on. but all of these are experimental. So is it possible that we're part of a larger structure? Absolutely, it's possible. But you have to provide evidence for it. You have to do experiments.
I have a lot of follow-up questions for you, but we can get lost in philosophy easily. So I'm going to park it aside and hopefully come back to it towards the end. We were talking about bioelectric signaling and bioelectricity. I just want to quickly touch upon what kind of experiments demonstrated the presence of this form of bioelectric signaling in the first place for you.
Well, the first thing I should say is that I did not discover bioelectricity. So bioelectricity has a very long history. There are many brilliant pioneers that were part of this field. I think the very earliest signs of it, well, the earliest signs of it were things like Galvani and Volta, who showed that electricity is relevant to living tissues. By the late 1800s, Dubois-Reymond showed that there are unique electrical properties to skin wounds. So he'd make little scratches in skin wounds and use a very primitive version of a voltmeter, basically to record properties of wounds in skin. And then by the early 1900s, people started measuring electrical properties in algae and eggs and all kinds of things. And then there were a few key pioneers. There was one of my personal heroes was this guy, Harold Burr. So Harold Burr, basically, this was 1930s. So we're talking about 1930s to 1940s. He had really nothing but a good voltmeter, and he went around measuring everything that he could measure: eggs, tumors, embryos, trees, psychiatric patients, you name it. He measured everything he could find. And on the basis of that, he developed a theory. Now, without the ability to do functional experiments back then, they didn't have any ability to do that. But he developed this theory that suggested that electrical communication, in particular he was focused on electrical fields per se. He had this theory that these fields are an instructive information layer that tells the chemistry what to do. And he turned out to be extremely prescient. I mean, this is such a remarkable thing to say back at a time when none of the really good data were available yet. And so, it's like he had a crystal ball. It's amazing. And all of the things he said in his books and papers have subsequently been proven true. And after that, there was a wave of experiments by numerous people that I could name, that did functional experiments, and they altered these electrical signals, and they showed that in fact the shape follows the electricity. So cells are very responsive to these gradients, and they're natural ways that cells use to hack and organize each other's behavior. So that existed. I became aware of all that stuff in the late 80s. As a teenager, I was in Vancouver at the World's Fair with my dad, and we went into a bookstore, and I found this book by Robert Becker called The Body Electric, and there was this bibliography at the back of the book that pointed to these older studies, and I said, "Oh my God, this is it. This is what I was looking for," which is really the link between physics and cognition. This is how mind enters matter. Basically, it's how you get computation and cognition out of physical things that evolution can produce. And it became very clear that this is not just something that, of course, everybody's been studying this in neuroscience, right? In neuroscience, this is not a controversial claim, but people outside of neuroscience really don't generally know that the brain gets all of its tricks from much more ancient system of cognitive glue that existed from the time of bacterial biofilms. That it's not, intelligence is not about brains and so on. So it was that was pretty obvious to me, and after reading all this stuff. And so what I wanted to do, and this is a huge part of what our lab does. It's not the only thing we do, but it's a huge part of what our lab does, and it's a big part of my career, is to use the example of bioelectricity to help understand cognition, to help understand embodied minds. What is the physics that mind can exploit to function and scale up in the physical world?
Let's start talking about some of the applications of it, but I think important again to get through another definition. Xenobots. What are Xenobots?
Xenobots. There's a couple of different ways to think about them. I'll tell you what they physically are, but I don't think that's really what they are. Physically, what they are, and this is work that was pioneered in my lab by Douglas Blackiston and our close collaborators Josh Bongard and Sam Kriegman at the University of Vermont to do all the computational parts of this work. So Xenobots are what you get when you liberate frog epithelial cells from the rest of the body. Now, it's a weird way to engineer because instead of adding something, we don't add materials, we don't add scaffolds, no bioengineered synthetic circuits. We're not editing the genome. We're not adding anything. What we're doing is removing the influences that normally hack these cells to have a boring life as the two-dimensional outer covering of a frog embryo, right? The skin. So this is one of the ways that you discover new intelligence in unfamiliar guises, is that you take away various constraints and you ask, what is it capable of doing when you're not making it do specific things? What does it want to do, so to speak? So it turns out that if you liberate these prospective skin cells from a frog embryo, what they do is they could do many things. They could crawl away from each other. They could die. They could make a two-dimensional monolayer like in cell culture. Instead, what they do is they come together in a little ball. They organize such that the cilia, the little hairs that on the outside of cells that normally move the mucus down the body of the frog, the hairs are pointing outward. And what it does is it becomes self-motile because it uses the little hairs to row against the water. So it starts zipping around, and so we call them Xenobots because Xenopus laevis is the name of the frog, the frog species that we use. I think it's among many other things, it's a biorobotics platform, and so that's why we call them Xenobots. But so first, what are they? Why is it interesting? What do they do? Well, first of all, they do a number. They express about 900 genes differently than the normal frog embryos do. Some of those genes, for example, relate to hearing. And we said, why are these things suddenly expressing genes related to hearing? Well, it turns out that if you put a speaker under the dish of the Xenobots, you can communicate to them with sound. You can make sound, and they will change their behaviors because they can sense the vibrations. Right? So normal embryos don't do that. So they have this new lifestyle. They're sort of zipping around. They have the ability to interact in new ways with signals from the environment. They also do this crazy thing called kinematic replication. So what happens is we've made it impossible for them to reproduce in the normal froggy way, right? Because they don't have any of those tissues. But it turns out that if you if you sprinkle a bunch of loose skin cells into the dish, and so you provide them with this material, what they do is they run around and they collect the material into piles, and they polish these piles into little balls. And because they're dealing with an agential material, meaning living cells that are not passive, the way that robot parts are passive, the balls themselves become the next generation of Xenobots. And when they mature, guess what they do? They run around and do the same thing, and you get the next generation. So they do this crazy kinematic self-replication. It's kind of von Neumann's dream of a robot that goes around and makes copies of itself from stuff it finds in the environment. But notice something really important. There's never been selection to be a good Xenobot. No other creature on Earth does kinematic replication. It's never been in their history to do that. Where does it come from? Because normally, when you ask about the shape and behavior of an organism, the answer is, selection. Millions of years of being selected to do this and that. Well, there hasn't been any Xenobots. And I don't know if you're going to get into this, but we also made Anthrobots, which is a similar thing made from adult human cells. And they do some amazing things too. Again, there hasn't been there's never been any Anthrobots. There's never been any selection to be a good Anthrobot. So one of the things that, so now we come back to the question, what are Xenobots? So here's a list of what they are. First of all, they are, you can say that they're the actual thing, the physical thing that's running around doing all these things. That's the Xenobot. You can say that. Another thing you could say, which I think is a little more profound, is you could say the Xenobot is a platform. It's a collection of us as the scientist, the cellular material that goes into it, the AI that the Bongard lab made to help us create different kinds of Xenobots. All of that. The Xenobot is all of that. The Xenobot is the whole, the system as a whole. Okay, it's the whole discovery platform. The third thing you could say is that no, actually, what they are an exploration tool for the latent space of possibilities. Normally, we see the frog embryo, which is the one outcome, and people think, well, that's what the frog genome knows how to do. It knows how to make this frog embryo. Well, no, turns out that hardware, that genetically specified hardware, can make other things. And so now, well, how do you know what else it can make? And so now we need to make tools to explore the latent space, or what I've called the Platonic space of forms that control and shape both anatomy and behavior. You can use Xenobots, Anthrobots, and various other things like this that are not the products of evolution to explore that space, to answer the question, well, where did that come from? I don't think it's an accident, and I don't think saying that it's emergent, that doesn't really do anything for us. I think much better is to say that there is a structured space out there that we can study using these kinds of things as exploration tools. So the Xenobot, I think, is all of those things. It is also a fourth thing. It is a proto-organism. It is an embodied primitive intelligence, which we are only now beginning to understand what are its actual capabilities. It can learn. It has memory capacity. It can do a couple of other things. And that means that it's something that's telling us about important things that we didn't know about how novel beings come into the world, beings that don't have an evolutionary history, but yet they have goals, they have some degree of cognitive performance, and they're telling us to really get serious about developing new forms of ethics, of being able to relate to beings that are not like us, not only not like us, but also not on the evolutionary tree with us. So you can't use the traditional method of determining how you're going to relate to someone by looking at where they are on the tree and saying, I'm going to treat them such and such because they're way back or they're close to us or whatever. It's not, that doesn't work anymore. So all of these things, that's what they are. They're all of those things.
I'm very glad you went for the more profound answer, but you're going to regret this because every time you give me a philosophical opening, I'm going to go right in. This is in my nature. I can't resist it. Let's try to go even more profound. You stated in the past that the end goal for this work is some form of an anatomical compiler. The DNA is the hardware and you don't have to rewire it, but the bioelectric signaling, it can be treated as some form of software that you can actually write. And you just spoke about exploring the latent space of what these Xenobots are capable of, and you've said at least one of the things they could do is they could you could direct them towards repairing organs, you could maintaining them, or even regenerating limbs and organs in a human body. How does this change our worldview? What would be the philosophical implication if we start living in a world where we have these synthetic organisms that can actually create new organisms, repair organs, regenerate limbs and organs? It feels like our entire worldview, our lifestyle is built on these processes that have this philosophy embedded around the mortality and the impermanence of the human body, or the fragility of it. There's so many checks and balances and safety and securities built into the system. If we start living into a world where we can start regenerating limbs and organs, or we can start creating organisms from scratch, would that change your worldview in any way? Would that have any philosophical weight?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that when you say there are safeties and securities built into our system, that is a very optimistic view. I mean, there are, of course, but if you look at the incredible amount of biomedical suffering that's out there, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical doctor. The emails I get every day from people in the most unbelievable circumstances are telling us that we need to be very careful with these kinds of ethical arguments, because what often people will say is, whenever I give talks about these things, people say, what are the ethical implications? What they really mean is, what are the dangers? Okay, everybody's asking, okay, you scientists, the unspoken assumption is that everything is great, and you scientists better not screw it up. Okay, don't do anything to make it worse. That's the unstated. Everybody always asks about the risks. Of course, we need to worry about the risks, no doubt. But what you can't forget is the opportunity cost, because I think it is ethically unconscionable to pretend that everything is fine now, and to say that what we're going to do is try to maintain status quo. I think this is incredible moral cowardice. I think mostly people who say this are young, healthy people. And as soon as they have a kid who's sick and they run to the hospital and pray like hell that somebody has figured something out, or they themselves, like the people that email me that they have a spinal cord injury or some horrible disease or something, it becomes very obvious that the status quo is really untenable. So I want to think about it in the following way. At some point back in the day, it was possible to have the following worldview. You could say that, look, natural. I want to be natural. Okay, we were created, and all of this was kind of figured out by a well-meaning intelligence that set this up in the correct way for us, in line with our goals and values, and let's stick to that. Okay, I think we can, looking around, if you've ever been in a pediatric oncology ward, I think that view goes out the window. You can say that is not the case. What we are the product of is a long history of trial and error. Evolution does not care about you or your goals or your values. Evolution works towards larger biomass. That's it. If you're good enough to persist and be observed in the future, good enough. Nothing else matters. And so we are the product of eons of random cosmic rays hitting the cytoplasm of our cells. Is there possibly an argument to say that that's what we should leave our life to? I think it's ridiculous and unconscionable. So here's what I think is going to happen. I think future people are going to look back in school. Kids in the future are going to look back on this time period the way that we look back on our primitive hominid ancestors, where you learn that you try to, when you were a kid, and you learn about how early man lived. And in fact, not that early, up until fairly recently, you think, my God, stepping on a sharp stick and getting an infection meant you get sepsis and died. And your teeth, you got a toothache that would drive you mad from the pain by the time you were 30, and your teeth would fall out, and all these incredible things. I think, how could they live this way? You think before antibiotics, before an understanding of the germ theory of surgery, of any of these things, how did people live this way? It's hard to imagine. I think the humans of the future are going to look back in this period, and they're going to say, wait a minute, you're trying to tell me that people were born and had to live their whole life in whatever body they were randomly given, with all of the limitations of IQ, of potential, of capabilities, and they got degenerative diseases, and they were susceptible to dumb bacteria and viruses and degenerative disease and all this stuff. And they just had to live the way that they were randomly born, with however, the mutation. That's how is that possible? How did they live this way? I hope that's where it's going, because I think it's completely inappropriate to leave it in the hands of these things that don't care anything about the massive suffering that's out there. And I think where we're going, and it's not just, I'm not saying that the way to it is bioelectricity and Xenobots, although I certainly hope that we're providing some steps in that direction. But overall, cracking the problem of how do you convince cellular agents to build one thing instead of another thing is going to radically rewrite medicine as a whole. And the idea of not just micromanaging molecular states the way we do now with drugs, but actually communicating goals, health goals to the somatic intelligence of the body is going to lead to something I call freedom of embodiment. And so what that means is it shouldn't be up to a bunch of dumb cosmic rays what your and the random meanderings of mutation and selection over the years, how you live your life. You should be in control of it. If you want a different embodiment, and I don't just mean a healthier standard human, because there's nothing magical about a standard modern human, whatever kind of embodiment you want to achieve your full potential, that is what you should have. And the only thing keeping us from it is ignorance. There's a lot of things we don't know how to do, and lack of imagination. And those things are going to be lifted over time, I hope.
I love this philosophical, or I guess this leap that we might be making with this line of work. And I'm very, very intrigued what future humans would say when they look back at this time. I'm going to try to
just to point out. Let's be clear. We've already made the leap, right? So toothbrush. So we're sitting here with glasses and toothbrushes and all of this stuff. We have left natural long behind. And so any attempts to say that those things are fine and heart transplants are fine, but no extension of your brain power. You stay at that 100 IQ that you have. Don't go above. This is all completely arbitrary. We've left natural behind long ago.
I'm going to sneak in one final big question when we start wrapping up, and maybe we make this quick, but then we were talking about the physical body at the moment, but would it be possible then to extend this to the mind and memories as well? Would it be possible to actually take a snapshot of the mind and then maybe download memories and have memories of a person go beyond just the physical body?
This is tricky to do in a short time frame. Overall, I think the answer is yes, but it is not going to be by copying the physical things inside your brain. So scanning your brain is not how we are going to get there, because you are not your brain. I take, and this is, I mean, everybody should know this is an unpopular, non-mainstream view that I have here. This is not what most scientists today believe, but I'm going to say that the things that we're interested in terms of the mind, the collection of things we call the mind, is not generated by your brain or even your body. Okay, it is a separate component, is a pattern from this Platonic space, just like many other patterns that inform dumb machines, simple machines and robots and Xenobots and everything else. Is it possible to build a new interface for that to come through into the physical world that doesn't look like the brain? Yes, I think it should be absolutely possible, but it is not going to be by copying your specific brain. It's going to be providing a new interface that allows that pattern. I mean, I think bottom line is that I think all of the things that we see around us, machines, embryos, cells, biobots, robots, we could talk about AIs and whatever, all of these things are pointers into the space of pattern. They're interfaces through which patterns of mind and behavior come through into the physical world. So yes, I'm sure we can build ourselves new embodiments that don't look like us, but it isn't because you've scanned the molecular synapses of your brain.
Well, this was an unfair question. I'm sure we could spend hours just talking about this one particular question itself, but I appreciate how much you've shared, and I'm sure I know for a fact that I find this particularly quite intriguing, and it's already opened up these avenues or these ideas of thought that I've never actually explored before. Okay, last two questions, rapid fire. What would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered after you're gone?
Well, I don't particularly care that I personally am remembered. I don't think that's important. What I'd like the legacy to be is that I would like to improve the current mind blindness that we all have. I think it is an existential level necessity for the species to become mature and to move into the future, to learn to recognize and ethically relate to very unconventional beings all around us. And I think that's what my work and the work of many others is trying to break down. And if I contribute to that in some way, if I make it easier for us to relate to other minds and to be able to have a more ethical interaction with them, I would be happy with that. And of course, also the biomedical stuff, right? So long before we get there, I would like to be helping patients. A lot of our work is in clinical, is going towards clinical regenerative medicine, and I would love to see patients help. But
you're already on the path to doing that. I think some of the work you're doing is some of the most powerful out there, and I'm glad that you're out there doing it. Final question.
It's not just me. I got, there's 42 people in my lab. So there's a lot of people that work really hard on this stuff, and other people in the community. You
and your entire team, I'm really happy you are there. Final question. Daniel Dennett had once said, if you can approach the world's complexities, both its glories and its horrors, with an attitude of humble curiosity, acknowledging that however deeply you have seen, you have only scratched the surface. You will find worlds within worlds, beauties you cannot heretofore imagine, and your own mundane preoccupations will shrink to proper size, not all that important in the greater scheme of things. We started out in the beginning of this conversation, we spoke about this universal goal or this purpose and being able to extract that. You are someone who has studied higher order goals, and you have approached this world with this humble curiosity and try to study these worlds within worlds that Dennett has described. So I would love to get your thoughts on the ultimate purpose, the ultimate telos, the ultimate meaning. What is the meaning of life, Michael Levin?
You saved the simple question for last. Right. Dan was an amazing person. Very, very hard to improve on things that Dan said. Okay, I have no idea what it would mean really to be able to state the meaning of life for anybody else. What I do have is a kind of a functional. I have a functional suggestion, because people email me all the time. They say, "Look, I read your book or your papers, or I read Sapolsky's book on free will or something else, and I realized that we are all made of a bag of cells. We're all a bag of cells, and there are all these laws governing our behavior. I don't know what to do with myself. What do I do now?" And so I can't tell you what the meaning of life for anybody else is, but I can make a functional suggestion. Two things. do the most interesting thing you can for as long as you can and be kind. That's it. I don't know what else to add to this. I don't know about the meaning of life, but functionally, if you want to know what to do next, what I say to these people that email me, do whatever amazing thing you were going to do before you read any of that stuff. Whatever you were going to do back, you can still do that. In fact, you should do that. The most interesting thing you can do for as long as you can, and be kind while you're doing it. I don't know what else to say beyond that.
I think they're great functional suggestions, and yeah, could be a good meaning of life. Professor, if people want to get involved, they want to find out more about the work or just stay connected, what is the best way to find you or your work?
Two things. There's my official lab website that has all the peer-reviewed kinds of things is drmichaellevin.org. One word. That's our lab website, drmichaellevin.org. And then there's a blog called thoughtforms.life. Again, one word, thoughtforms.life. And that's a personal blog where I write about what I think this stuff means in a bigger context. There's also a YouTube channel, a Dr. Michael Levin YouTube channel that has videos from our center.
Multiple ways to find you. I recommend all of them. Professor, this has been an honor for me. Thank you so much for such a fantastic conversation.